I stood in the sorting room of a Whittier halibut processing plant, wearing rubber waders coated in fish scales and bleach. My fingers were numb as I stared at a thin paper receipt from the break room ATM. Declined. Insufficient funds for a $400 withdrawal. To understand how a wilderness content creator ended up gutting flatfish just to afford firewood for a dry cabin, you have to rewind 3 weeks. You have to step inside my mother's pristine kitchen in Wasilla. My name is Claire. I am 29 years old. I make a living documenting backcountry survival in the Alaskan wilderness. I know how to navigate freezing temperatures and isolated terrain. But nothing prepared me for the financial ambush waiting inside my own family. If you have ever had a parent treat your bank account like a communal checking account, you need to hear this. Let me know your age and what state you are watching from in the comments below. Welcome back to Ariana Revenger, where we trade polite silence for cold, hard boundaries. Hit subscribe to see how locking my credit card ended up bringing federal agents to my mother's front door. 3 weeks before that declined receipt, Diane called a family meeting. She views my outdoor career as a hobby, something trivial, compared to my brother's corporate salary. I walked into her house bringing a draft of winter air and snow on my boots. She stood at her granite island distributing glossy travel itineraries for a midwinter trip to Maui. She handed copies to my brother and his wife. Then she looked at my boots, slid a brochure across the stone counter, and delivered the ultimatum. "The flights are $3,500 each," she said. "If you cannot afford it, stay home." I looked at the brochure. I did not raise my voice. I accepted the exclusion calmly because arguing with Diane only feeds her need for control. I turned to walk out. Right before I reached the front door, she smoothed a piece of paper on the counter and tossed an offhand remark at my back. "Do not worry about the flight cost, Claire. The business will pay for it eventually. Brand synergy." I thought she was taking a petty jab at my influencer lifestyle. I assumed she was mocking my brand sponsorships. I pushed the door open, walked out to my truck, and turned the ignition. 15 minutes later, driving south on the park's highway, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. A priority fraud alert from my commercial bank. $14,000 had just been charged to my production LLC. 4 business-class tickets to Hawaii. None of the passengers were me. I pulled my truck onto the icy shoulder of the highway and put it in park. I read the notification on the screen. The math snapped into place. This was not a data breach from a random website. The thief was sitting in a warm kitchen in Wasilla, acting as a travel agent with my corporate funds. I tapped the dispute icon and initiated a hard lock on the card. I put my truck in drive and headed home to Palmer, believing I had just stopped a single brazen theft. I had no idea I had just triggered an automated financial trap that was about to gut my entire life. The industrial hum of a Whittier processing plant does not leave your ears when your shift ends. It settles into your jaw and vibrates down your spine. I stood in the employee break room under a flickering fluorescent tube, wearing rubber waders coated in a stubborn layer of bleach and flatfish scales. My hands were cracked from the cold water, and my shoulders ached from 8 hours of gutting halibut on a metal conveyor belt. I peeled off my right glove and pressed my frozen index finger against the keypad of the corner ATM. I requested a $400 withdrawal to pay for a cord of birch firewood. The machine whirred for a few seconds before spitting out a thin slip of thermal paper. Declined. Insufficient funds. I stared at the black ink on that receipt and felt the temperature in my chest match the freezing air outside. I was bankrupt. A month prior, I was a successful wilderness content creator, managing lucrative brand deals and a thriving production company. Now I was working manual labor just to keep the wood stove in my cabin burning. To understand how a woman who built an independent life out of backcountry survival ended up gutting fish to survive her own family, you have to rewind 3 weeks. You have to step out of the processing plant and into the pristine, climate-controlled environment of my mother's kitchen. My name is Claire. I am 29 years old, and I document the remote Alaskan wilderness for a living. I know how to navigate glacier crevasses and isolated tundra, but nothing in my professional training prepared me for the financial ambush waiting inside my own family tree. If you have ever had a parent treat your bank account like a communal asset or use your hard-earned stability to fund their own lifestyle, you need to hear this story. Let me know your age and what state you are watching from in the comments below. Welcome back to Ariana Revenger, where we trade polite silence for cold, hard boundaries. Hit subscribe to see how tapping a single button on a banking app ended up bringing federal agents to my mother's front door. 3 weeks before that declined receipt, my mother Diane summoned our family to her house in Wasilla for a mandatory Sunday meeting. Diane lives in a sprawling suburban fortress with heated driveways and cathedral ceilings. To her, the Alaskan winter is an inconvenience to be managed with wealth. She views my career in the wilderness as a dirty hobby, a quaint little project compared to the six-figure salary my older brother Luke pulls down, working on an oil rig up on the North Slope. I drove down from Palmer and walked into her kitchen bringing a draft of 0-degree air and packed snow on my boots. The house smelled of expensive vanilla candles and fresh coffee. Luke was already sitting at the granite island wearing premium outdoor brands. He never actually gets dirty. His wife sat beside him holding a ceramic mug. Diane stood at the head of the island sorting through a stack of thick, glossy travel brochures. She did not offer me coffee. She looked at the mud melting off my boots onto her hardwood floor and handed a brochure to Luke. She announced a midwinter tropical escape to Maui, a classic flex for affluent Alaskans desperate to break up the dark months. She laid out the itinerary with the precision of a corporate event planner. Oceanfront suites, private catamaran charters, reservations at restaurants where the appetizers cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She detailed the travel dates and the business class seating arrangements. Then she slid a brochure across the granite toward me. She stopped it just short of my reach. "The flights are $3,500 each," she said. Her tone was brisk and entirely devoid of warmth. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the glossy paper. "If you cannot afford it, stay home. Stay." I looked at the brochure resting on the stone counter. I did not raise my voice or defend my income. Defending myself to Diane only feeds her deep need for control. I accepted the exclusion with the same calm I use when a winter storm grounds my flights. I nodded once. I told her I hoped they enjoy the sun, and I turned around to walk back out into the cold. Right before my hand found the brass doorknob. She smoothed the paper on the counter and tossed an offhand remark at my back. "Do not worry about the flight cost, Claire. The business will pay for it eventually. Brand synergy." I paused with my hand on the metal. I assumed she was taking a petty jab at my influencer lifestyle. I thought she was mocking my corporate sponsorships, suggesting my company was just a gimmick that might one day buy me a vacation. I did not argue. I pushed the heavy door open, stepped out into the freezing afternoon, and climbed into the cab of my truck. I turned the ignition and let the heater blow cold air against my face while the engine warmed up. 15 minutes later, I was driving south on the Parks Highway. The road was slick with black ice and the sky was already turning a bruised purple as the sun dipped behind the Chugach Mountains. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was a priority fraud alert from my commercial bank. I pulled my truck onto the icy shoulder of the highway and shifted into park. I picked up the phone and read the notification on the screen. $14,000 had just been charged to My Production, LLC. The merchant was a major commercial airline. The purchase was for 4 business-class tickets to Hawaii. I sat in the idling truck and did the math. 3,500 multiplied by 4 is exactly 14,000. Diane Luke, his wife, and a spare ticket for whoever Diane deemed worthy of her generosity. None of the passengers were me. The reality of the situation locked into place with terrifying clarity. This was not a random data breach. A hacker on the other side of the globe had not skimmed my numbers. The thief was sitting in a warm kitchen in Wasilla, acting as a travel agent with my corporate funds. Her parting remark was not a joke about my career. It was a literal confession of corporate fraud delivered straight to my face. I did not panic. I opened my mobile banking application and navigated to the security dashboard. I tapped the dispute icon and initiated a hard lock on the commercial credit card. The screen turned gray, indicating the account was frozen. I put my truck back in drive and pulled onto the highway, heading toward my cabin in Palmer. I believed I had just stopped a single brazen theft. I thought freezing the card was the end of the conflict. I had no idea that drawing this simple boundary had just triggered an automated financial trap designed years ago. I did not know I had just initiated a chain reaction that would gut my entire life before the month was over. I turned my truck off the paved stretch of the highway and guided the tires onto the rutted dirt road leading to my property in Palmer. The Alaskan winter twilight had already swallowed the horizon, leaving only the sharp outline of the Chugach Mountains against a bruised sky. Living in a dry cabin is a deliberate rejection of the comfort my mother worships. It means I have no indoor plumbing and no central heating. I haul my own drinking water in heavy blue jugs from a local community spring down the road. I heat the 400-square-foot space entirely with a cast-iron wood stove. Maintaining this life requires daily intentional physical labor, splitting birch logs, stoking embers, and monitoring the temperature forces a rhythm that leaves no room for synthetic anxiety. I chose this off-grid existence to build a foundation of self-reliance, ensuring I would never owe anyone a debt for my basic survival. I parked my truck near the woodshed, carried 2 heavy loads of firewood inside, and struck a match as the kindling caught and the thick metal stove began to radiate warmth. I peeled off my insulated jacket. I believed I was safe. I thought the frozen credit card was a digital wall my mother could not breach. I assumed the conflict had been contained to an uncomfortable phone notification. Barely an hour had passed before high-beam headlights swept across my front windows, casting long, frantic shadows against the interior log walls. The roar of a high-output engine shattered the evening quiet. I heard expensive tires locking up and skidding across the packed snow of my driveway, kicking up sharp gravel and ice. It was a pristine, newly leased luxury sport utility vehicle, entirely out of place in the dense spruce woods. The driver's side door slammed shut with a heavy thud. Urgent footsteps crunched up my wooden porch stairs. Fists hammered against my solid spruce door. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic, demanding rhythm of a person who has never been told no and does not intend to learn today. I did not rush. I set down my iron fire poker, walked across the small room, and turned the brass handle. Diane stood on my porch. She wore a tailored wool coat, left unbuttoned, oblivious to the single-digit temperature biting at her skin. In her right hand, she gripped her smartphone, the screen glowing bright against the dark tree line behind her. She did not say hello. She did not ask if I had made it home safely over the icy roads. She shoved the phone toward my face. The screen displayed a stark red cancellation banner from the commercial airline. "Call your bank right now," she demanded. Her voice carried the sharp, clipped tone of a manager reprimanding a negligent subordinate. "Tell them it is a mistake. Clear the hold. They just wiped out our confirmation numbers." I looked at the glowing screen, then looked at the woman standing on my porch. The sheer nerve it took to drive to my home and issue orders after attempting to steal thousands of dollars was staggering. I kept my breathing even, refusing to match her frantic energy. I asked her a single direct question. "How did you get my corporate card numbers?" Diane let out a short, dismissive breath. She waved her free hand in the air as if swatting away a minor nuisance. She ignored the question entirely, pivoting to the defense she had clearly rehearsed on the drive over. "I was floating those tickets until my tax return clears," she said, her tone dripping with intense exasperation. "It is a temporary hold, Claire. We are trying to plan a family bonding experience, and you are throwing a tantrum over a routine loan. Fix the glitch." She framed the unauthorized charge of $14,000 as a casual favor I was obstructing. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. She was merely rearranging resources she felt entitled to manage. Her logic operated on a terrifying assumption that my business revenue was an extension of her own wallet. The narrative she spun instantly transformed her into the victim of my rigid, uncooperative behavior. She was accusing me of sabotaging our family unity over technicalities. She fully expected me to pick up my phone, wait on hold with a customer service representative, unlock the compromised account, and then apologize to her for causing a logistical headache. The air on the porch was bitter cold, freezing the moisture in my breath as I exhaled. I stood there observing the woman who raised me. I recognized the desperate entitlement radiating from her posture. She wanted a fight. She wanted me to shout to lose control so she could label me hysterical and justify her actions to my brother. If I raised my voice, she would have the ammunition she needed to paint me as the unstable daughter ruining a wholesome family vacation. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I did not elevate my volume. I did not debate the legal definition of a loan versus grand larceny. I looked at her manicured fingers gripping the glowing phone, and then I looked at her face. I stepped backward into the quiet warmth of my cabin. I pulled the heavy spruce door shut right in her face. I turned the deadbolt. The heavy metal mechanism clicking into place was the sharpest, loudest sound in the Matanuska Valley. It was a definitive physical barrier drawn between my sanctuary and her chaos. Through the thick wood, I heard her gasp in indignation. I heard her strike the door one final time with the flat of her palm, the sound dull and ineffective against the thick timber. A few seconds later, her footsteps retreated down the wooden stairs. The luxury engine revved hard. The tires spun uselessly on the ice for a moment before catching, and the red taillights faded into the dark trees. I walked back to the wood stove and watched the flames curl around the birch bark. I felt a brief surge of victory. I thought shutting her out had ended the confrontation. I assumed that by locking the door and freezing the card, I had successfully protected my livelihood. I believed I had drawn a line she could not cross. I was dangerously naive. A wooden door can block a physical intruder, but it cannot stop a digital hemorrhage. The real threat was not standing on my porch demanding compliance. The real threat was buried deep within the fine print of my business documents, waiting patiently for regular banking hours to resume. When Monday morning arrived, I would learn that my mother did not need my permission to access my funds, and shutting the door had only trapped me inside a financial collapse I could not escape. The weekend passed in a deceptive quiet. By Monday morning, the frigid Alaskan air had seeped through the log walls of my cabin. I woke up early as the fire in the cast iron stove burned down to fine white ash. I boiled water on the flat iron top and stirred a spoonful of instant coffee into a tin mug. I sat at my small wooden table, wrapped my cold hands around the warm metal, and opened my laptop. I expected a routine administrative task. I had my commercial account number written on a yellow sticky note, and I dialed the bank fraud department ready to sign a standard affidavit to reverse the $14,000 airline charge. The hold music was a cheerful piano tune that looped endlessly, a stark contrast to the grim reality of my situation. When a representative finally answered, I recited my security credentials and explained the events of the previous evening. I used clear professional terms, describing the unauthorized purchase of 4 business-class tickets to Maui and requesting an immediate chargeback to my production company. The representative typed on his end. The rhythmic clacking of his keyboard echoed through the receiver. Then his voice returned, carrying the flat, neutral tone of an institution bound by rigid bylaws. He informed me he could not initiate a fraud protocol. He stated the transaction was legally valid and approved by an authorized party. I asked him to repeat himself. I assumed I had misheard him over a poor cellular connection. He explained that the purchase was executed by a registered signer on the corporate account. I asked him to read the name aloud. He read Diane Evans. The tin mug in my hand felt suddenly very heavy. 2 years ago, when my wilderness channel first gained traction and outdoor brand deals started trickling in, I needed to establish a formal limited liability company to manage the revenue. I was overwhelmed with remote filming schedules, editing timelines, and securing permits. Diane had offered to handle the tedious incorporation paperwork. She presented her involvement as a generous favor to a busy daughter. She brought a stack of forms to a diner in Wasilla and pointed to the dotted lines while I drank hot tea. She told me she was setting herself up as an emergency contact in case I was ever injured on a backcountry shoot and unable to manage my affairs. I signed the pages without securing independent legal counsel or reviewing the fine print. I trusted the woman who raised me. She did not list herself as an emergency contact. She legally embedded herself as a co-manager with full purchasing authority over the corporate credit line. To the bank, this was not grand larceny or identity theft. This was two business partners having a disagreement over travel expenses. The representative politely advised me that any financial dispute over authorized purchases would need to be settled in civil court. He could not reverse the funds. He could not freeze the account against her access without a court order. The money was gone. My production company was legally liable for the debt. I ended the call and stared at the dark screen of my phone. A chilling realization crawled up my throat, tightening my chest. If my mother had laid a trap in my business documents 2 years ago, I needed to know what else she had access to. I realized I had never truly audited my own identity. I had spent my entire adult life navigating glaciers and tracking wildlife, but I had left my financial perimeter unguarded. I opened a new browser window and began a systematic excavation of my public records. I started with the most basic financial footprint available to any state resident. Every October, the state distributes a share of the oil revenue to eligible citizens. This payout is known as the Permanent Fund Dividend. It is a vital economic cornerstone of local life. Families rely on it to buy winter tires, stock up on heating fuel, or repair their roofs before the snow falls. For 11 years, I believed I did not qualify for the disbursement due to a bureaucratic technicality involving my residency status during a brief stint out of state after high school. Diane had always managed my early tax filings and handled the correspondence with the Revenue Department. She told me the state had disqualified me, and I had simply accepted her word. I navigated to the state government portal and initiated a password reset using my Social Security number. My heart beat a heavy, uneven rhythm against my ribs as I waited for the verification email. When the dashboard finally loaded, I clicked on the Payment History tab. Rows of green text populated the screen. Every single year since I turned 18, a dividend ranging from $1,000 to $2,000 had been approved and disbursed under my name. I had never seen a single cent of it. I clicked on the routing details for the most recent deposit to trace where the funds were going. The money was not being sent to a standard checking account or a generic savings ledger. The payouts were being automatically diverted into an account labeled a Survivor Custodial Trust. The name of that specific trust pulled a deeply buried memory to the surface. It transported me back to a bleak November afternoon shortly after my 18th birthday. Diane had sat me down at her granite kitchen island. She placed a dense legal document in front of me. She looked exhausted, wearing the heavy burden of a widow raising children alone. She told me a very specific and terrifying story. When my father drowned in the Bering Sea, his commercial fishing boat sank to the bottom of the ocean with him. Diane explained that the vessel carried residual maritime debts. She claimed the commercial creditors were relentless and had the legal right to garnish our current assets to settle the outstanding balance left by the shipwreck. She told me the only way to protect my future was to route my annual state dividends directly into a custodial trust designed to appease those phantom creditors. She framed the diversion of funds as a necessary noble sacrifice to keep the family solvent and protect our home from foreclosure. She asked me to sign the authorization to honor my father and save our family. I was a grieving teenager who deeply missed her dad. I signed the paper without a second thought. Looking at the digital ledger on my laptop, I saw the truth naked and undeniable. There were no residual maritime creditors hunting us down. Commercial maritime insurance had settled the boat debts decades ago. The Survivor Custodial Trust was a financial ghost ship designed and piloted entirely by my mother. She had weaponized the tragic death of my father and my own childhood grief to secure a continuous stream of untraceable income. I sat at the small wooden table while the cabin grew cold around me. I calculated the math in my head. 11 years of intercepted state dividends. It amounted to tens of thousands of dollars stolen directly from my legal entitlement. Diane had meticulously logged into the state portal every single year, forged my digital signature, completed the eligibility questionnaire pretending to be me, and routed the money into a shadow account she controlled. This was not a fleeting moment of poor judgment or a temporary lapse in morality. It was not a mother taking a small loan in a moment of panic to keep the lights on during a harsh winter. This was premeditated, systematic paper-trailed exploitation executed over a decade. She had spent 10 years smiling at me across holiday dinner tables, accepting gifts from me, and critiquing my lifestyle, all while knowing she was actively skimming my identity to subsidize her own comfort. I closed the laptop and rubbed my eyes. The exhaustion I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced after a grueling backcountry hike or a long fishing trip. It was a deep, hollow fatigue that settles into your bones when you realize the foundation of your life is built on a crime scene. I thought uncovering the trust was the worst of the betrayal. I assumed I had hit the very bottom of the deception. I prepared myself to find a lawyer and untangle the civil mess of the corporate card and the stolen dividends. I did not realize that exposing the trust was merely scratching the surface of her financial architecture. The most devastating blow was still hiding in the fine print of my corporate credit profile, waiting to trigger a mechanism that would paralyze my entire livelihood before the week was over. I spent the next 48 hours aggressively auditing every piece of paper tied to my name. I pulled full comprehensive reports from all 3 major credit bureaus. I requested certified copies of my corporate filings from the State Commerce Department. The documents arrived in my email inbox like a series of slow, deliberate blows. The $14,000 airline charge and the stolen dividends were merely surface wounds compared to the deep structural damage waiting inside my credit profile. Buried underneath my production company profile sat a secondary shadow account I had never authorized. It was a commercial business loan originated 14 months prior. The principal amount was $45,000. The application had been filed online, and the funds were disbursed to an external holding account controlled by Diane. She had used my company revenue history and my pristine credit score as proof of income to secure the capital. I traced the outbound transfers from that holding account. The money did not go toward backcountry filming equipment or production insurance. It went toward down payments on high-end snowmobiles she kept parked outside her garage in Wasilla. It went toward covering tabs at upscale seafood restaurants in Anchorage where she entertained her friends. It funded the very lifestyle she used to judge my off-grid existence. Diane had been making the minimum monthly payments on this shadow loan for over a year, keeping the account in good standing and entirely off my radar. The payments were set up on an automatic draft, pulling from the very corporate credit line I had locked on Sunday evening. When I initiated the hard freeze on that card to stop the Maui flights, I unknowingly severed the automatic draft. The shadow loan payment scheduled for that Monday bounced. A second attempt on Tuesday also failed. The commercial lender did not wait around for an explanation. They operated on algorithms and risk mitigation protocols. The $45,000 loan was immediately flagged as delinquent and pushed into default status. This triggered a banking mechanism I had never heard of before. It is called a cross-collateralization clause. It is a standard piece of fine print buried in commercial lending agreements. It essentially dictates that if a business defaults on one credit product, the financial institution holds the legal right to seize funds from any other account held by that same business to satisfy the debt. Because Diane had listed my production company as the primary guarantor on the shadow loan, the lender cast a wide automated net across my entire banking profile. That Friday, the financial trap snapped shut. I had recently wrapped a grueling 3-week winter camping shoot for my primary sponsor. They are a prominent international brand specializing in extreme weather survival gear. They rely on my authentic field tests to market their products. Friday was the scheduled payout date for my quarterly contract. $12,000 was supposed to land in my primary business checking account to cover my operating expenses, future travel logistics, and my personal cabin rent for the upcoming season. I logged into my banking app that morning expecting to see the deposit clear. Instead, I saw a balance of $0. I refreshed the page. The balance remained $0. I clicked into the transaction history to trace the incoming wire. The $12,000 had arrived exactly on time, but in the very same minute, a secondary transaction was executed by the bank. The entry was labeled as an internal asset seizure. The algorithm had detected the incoming funds, identified the default status of the shadow loan linked to my profile, and instantly swept every single dollar to cover the delinquent commercial debt. The bank did not call to ask for permission or warn me of the impending action. The software simply repossessed my quarterly income to pay for my mother's luxury snowmobiles. I was financially paralyzed. I had a meager $400 left in my personal savings. That was barely enough to cover a cord of firewood and a few weeks of dry goods. My production company was functionally bankrupt. 2 hours later, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of the marketing director from the survival gear brand. We usually spoke with a casual, friendly rhythm discussing camera angles and upcoming product launches. Today his voice was tight and formal. He informed me that their accounting department had received a concerning notification. When the wire transfer was swept by the bank, it triggered an automated risk alert, flagging my vendor profile for severe financial irregularities. He explained that their corporate policy prohibited them from maintaining active contracts with ambassadors whose business entities were in active default or under commercial seizure protocols. They could not risk the brand being associated with potential financial instability or pending litigation. I used careful corporate language. He told me they were pausing our partnership indefinitely until I could provide certified documentation proving my accounts were clear and stable. He wished me the best and ended the call. I sat in my truck in the driveway with the engine off, holding the dead phone. In the span of a 5-minute conversation, I lost my primary source of income and the professional reputation I had spent years building in the outdoor industry. The independence I had fought so hard to cultivate out here in the wilderness had been dismantled by a few lines of code and a fraudulent signature. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone. A heavy, crushing numbness settled over me. I stepped out of the truck and walked over to the woodshed. The air was biting cold, but I did not put on my heavy parka. I picked up my splitting maul and dragged a thick round of birch onto the chopping block. I swung the heavy iron blade down. The wood split with a sharp, satisfying crack. I placed another round on the block and swung again. The physical exertion was the only thing keeping my mind from fracturing. I chopped wood for 2 hours until my arms burned and my breath came in ragged gasps. Every swing of the axe was a visceral reminder of the raw, exhausting labor required to simply survive a winter off the grid. This honest, tangible effort stood in stark contrast to the synthetic, fraudulent momentum of the life my mother was leading. She was floating on stolen credit while I was sweating in the freezing air just to afford heat. I stacked the fresh split wood against the cabin wall and wiped the sweat from my forehead. The physical exhaustion cleared the fog from my brain. I realized that ignoring the problem or trying to manage it through quiet banking disputes was no longer an option. Diane had not just inconvenienced me. She had weaponized my identity and destroyed my livelihood. The cross-collateralization seizure proved that the financial infection was spreading faster than I could patch it. If I did not confront her directly and force her to dismantle the trap she had built, she would drag me into permanent bankruptcy without a second thought. I dropped the mall by the block and walked back inside to grab my keys. I had avoided fighting her on her territory my entire life. But the rules of engagement had changed. I was not going to send an email or draft a polite text message. I was going to drive to Wasilla and demand the truth to her face. I did not realize that walking into her pristine house to demand accountability would force me to confront the darkest ghost of our family history and push me past the edge of my own sanity. I turned the key in the ignition and steered my truck back onto the paved highway. The heater fought a losing battle against the frozen windshield, blowing lukewarm air across the glass as I drove south toward Wasilla. The miles of black asphalt blurred past the towering snowbanks. My anger warred with a darker, older memory. To comprehend how my mother constructed a financial crime ring out of her own daughter U.S. identity, you have to rewind far past the corporate filings and the stolen dividends. You must travel back to the winter of 2003. I do not hate Diane with a blind, ignorant fury. I know the exact origin of her fracture. I know the precise moment the woman who raised me was replaced by a terrified survivor. My father made his living on the Bering Sea. He was a commercial crabber working out of Dutch Harbor, chasing quotas through some of the most unforgiving water on the planet. He was a man defined by calloused hands, thick wool sweaters, and the smell of diesel fuel. He understood the ocean was an indifferent landlord. That year, a brutal winter storm caught his vessel off guard. A rogue wave crested over the stern and rolled the boat. The sea claimed him and 3 other crew members. I was 8 years old when the Coast Guard chaplain stood on our front porch to deliver the news. The chaplain offered prayers, but prayers do not pay a mortgage. Diane was thrust into a chilling vacuum. She was 32 years old, holding a staggering banknote on a house we could no longer afford, raising 2 children, and holding 0 income. The life insurance policy was tangled in a maritime investigation regarding the shipwreck locking away any immediate payout. In Alaska, poverty during the dark months is not merely inconvenient, it is lethal. Without heating, oil pipes burst and hypothermia creeps through the drywall. I watched my mother systematically dismantle the life my father built just to keep the furnace running. First, she sold his heavy-duty pickup truck to a neighbor for a fraction of its worth. Next went the commercial fishing gear, the heavy weather suits, the radios. When the cash from the equipment ran dry, she walked into a pawn shop in downtown Anchorage and traded her gold wedding band for a heating fuel delivery. I remember wearing 3 layers of sweaters inside the house while Diane boiled snow on a propane camp stove because the utility company had shut off the municipal water. She gave me the last preserved salmon fillet from the pantry and drank a cup of hot water for her own dinner. She starved herself to keep her children breathing. That desperate environment forged a new moral compass. One specific night remains burned into my memory. A severe blizzard was howling against the siding, rattling the window panes. I crept out of my bedroom because the cold draft was keeping me awake. I found Diane sitting alone at the kitchen table, illuminated by a single battery-powered lantern. She had a stack of foreclosure notices spread across the laminate surface alongside a denied life insurance claim. She held a blue pen. I stood quietly in the hallway and watched her practice my deceased father, U.S. signature on a scrap of newspaper. Over and over she traced the loops and sharp angles of his handwriting. She was teaching her muscles to mimic a dead man. When she perfected the forgery, she pulled the official bank document toward her and signed his name on the dotted line. She looked up and saw me standing in the shadows. Her face was hollowed out by grief and stark terror. The flickering lantern light cast dark circles under her eyes. She did not hide the pen or pretend she was doing something else. She looked at me with a fierce, chilling clarity. "Paperwork is just survival, Claire," she whispered. "The rules are for people who are not freezing." That night embedded a deep frontier panic into her bones. The trauma of almost losing her children to the cold rewired her brain. She no longer viewed money as a tool for comfort or a metric of success. She viewed wealth as the only viable weapon against death. Over the next 2 decades, as she slowly climbed out of ruin, started a new career, and built a veneer of suburban stability, that panic never subsided. It merely dressed itself in designer coats and luxury sport utility vehicles. She hoards resources because she genuinely believes that stepping back into poverty is a fatal disease. Every dollar she stockpiles is a brick in a wall keeping the Bering Sea at bay. The teenage girl, watching her forge a signature, grew up to become an adult woman with pristine credit and a profitable production company. To Diane, my financial stability was not an independent achievement to be celebrated. It was an untapped reservoir of survival material. Forging my name on the state dividend forms and hijacking my corporate credit line felt no different to her than forging my father U.S. name to save the house. The mechanics were identical. The justification was already ingrained in her psyche. Understanding her trauma does not excuse the theft. Her past suffering does not grant her amnesty to harvest my future, but it explains her terrifying lack of remorse. In her mind, skimming my corporate accounts and rerouting my state payouts is not a crime. It is an act of desperate preservation. She views my independent off-grid lifestyle in the Palmer Woods as a reckless flirtation with the very destitution that almost killed us. She hates my dry cabin and my wood stove because they remind her of the year she had to boil snow. By seizing my assets, she believes she is managing our collective survival. She expects me to thank her for keeping the invisible wolves from the door. I squeezed the steering wheel as the highway transitioned into the sprawling, plowed streets of her subdivision. The empathy I held for the young widow she used to be warred with the rage I felt toward the thief she had become. The past offered context, but it could not pay my delinquent shadow loans. It could not unfreeze my incoming sponsor wires or repair my professional reputation. I could not allow her trauma to dictate the terms of my ruin. I navigated the turns into her affluent neighborhood. The houses here sat on large manicured lots, fortified against the elements by wealth and reliable municipal grids. I parked my mud-splattered truck behind her pristine vehicle. The contrast between my battered exterior and her polished facade had never felt so sharp. I reached across the center console and grabbed the printed financial audits, the cross-collateralization notices, and the trust ledger from my passenger seat. The time for silent understanding had expired. I stepped out of the truck into the biting wind. I marched up her shoveled concrete walkway, preparing to tear down the fortress she had built out of my stolen identity, unaware that breaking her illusion would push both of us past the point of return and set a shattering confrontation into motion. I did not bother to knock. The heavy oak front door of her house was unlocked, an arrogant symbol of a woman who believes the world bends to her comfort. I pushed it open and stepped into the sprawling foyer. The air inside was stiflingly warm, smelling of expensive vanilla and roasted coffee. The sheer normalcy of her environment, the polished hardwood floors and the vaulted ceilings collided violently with the absolute panic screaming through my nervous system. I walked straight through the living room, my muddy boots leaving dark tracks on her pristine, cream-colored rugs. I found her in the kitchen. She was standing at her massive granite island, pouring hot water from an electric kettle into a French press. She wore cashmere loungewear, looking every inch the established, comfortable matriarch. She glanced up as I entered. Her expression immediately hardened at the sight of my boots ruining her floor. She opened her mouth to issue a reprimand about the mud. I did not let her speak. I slammed the thick stack of printed financial audits, the cross-collateralization notices, and the state trust ledger directly onto the granite counter. The papers scattered across the smooth stone. "You stole my life," I screamed. The sound of my own voice startled me. It was raw and ragged, cracking at the edges. The polished, measured persona I utilized for my wilderness videos was entirely gone. I was running on pure, terrified adrenaline. The fear of losing my cabin, my sponsors, and my entire reputation surged up my throat. "I have $0 in my checking account," I yelled, jabbing my frozen, cracked finger at the banking printouts. "The commercial lender seized my quarterly sponsor wire because you defaulted on a $45,000 shadow loan you took out in my company's name. You have been stealing my state dividends for a decade. You hijacked my business." Diane did not look at the papers. She did not express shock or attempt to deny the accusations. Her immediate reaction was to glance sharply toward the large bay windows overlooking the neighboring properties. She raised both hands, palms facing outward, adopting a harsh, hushed tone. "Keep your voice down, Claire," she hissed. "You are acting hysterical. The neighbors do not need to hear your dramatics over a simple accounting error." Her priority was the audience. She was more concerned about maintaining the illusion of suburban perfection than addressing the fact she had bankrupted her own daughter. The sheer calculation of her response snapped the last remaining tether, holding my composure together. My empathy for the terrified widow, she used to be evaporated, replaced entirely by a blinding, unadulterated fury. She was dismissing my financial ruin as a crude disruption of her morning routine. "I am not acting hysterical," I roared, my volume escalating. "You are a thief. You built a criminal enterprise out of my signature. You bought snowmobiles with my credit while I am chopping wood just to keep from freezing to death. You ruined my business." She stepped closer to the island, leaning over the scattered papers, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Stop playing the victim," she snapped, her voice low and venomous. "I managed those accounts to ensure the family stayed solvent. If you had an ounce of gratitude for the sacrifices I made, you would understand that pooling resources is how we survive. You are overreacting to a temporary cash flow issue. I will fix the bank hold when my tax return clears." The word gratitude ignited a physical reaction in my body. She was demanding thanks for the privilege of being exploited. The sheer suffocating weight of her delusion pushed me into an action I had never taken in my entire life. I completely unglued. I swept my right arm violently across the surface of the granite island. I meant to sweep the fraudulent paperwork onto the floor, a chaotic gesture of rejection. But my heavy winter sleeve caught the edge of the object sitting near the French press. It was a heavy ceramic coffee mug, a faded chipped souvenir from Dutch Harbor featuring a badly painted crab boat. It was the absolute last physical item my father had touched before leaving for his final fatal rotation on the Bering Sea. Diane had kept it sitting on that counter for 20 years. It was the untouchable centerpiece of her kitchen, a calculated prop she used to anchor her identity as the grieving noble widow. The mug flew off the granite edge. Time seemed to slow down as it fell. It struck the polished hardwood floor and exploded. The thick ceramic shattered into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces, scattering across the expensive rug and under the stainless steel appliances. The sharp crash echoed through the cavernous house. Sudden heavy silence rushed into the room, thick enough to choke on. The destruction of that specific object felt catastrophic. I stood frozen, my arms still suspended in the air, staring down at the broken shards of my father's memory. Diane stared at the floor. The color drained from her face, leaving her features stark and rigid. The destruction of her sacred prop shattered the untouchable myth of her martyrdom. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine horror in her eyes. I expected her to weep. I expected her to collapse or mourn the loss of the artifact. She did neither. The horror vanished, replaced by an ancient, terrifying rage. She stepped around the granite island, her bare feet crunching on the ceramic dust. She closed the distance between us until she was inches from my face. She did not yell. Her voice dropped to a lethal, vibrating whisper. "I kept a roof over your head when the sea took your father." She hissed, every word laced with poison. "I sold my blood and my future so you wouldn't freeze in the dark. I built this family back from nothing. You owe me your survival. You owe me every dollar you make, and you owe me your respect. You are an ungrateful child throwing a tantrum because I asked you to carry your share of the weight." She was not apologizing. She was enforcing a debt she believed was eternal. In her mind, my entire existence was a loan she had underwritten, and she possessed the absolute right to collect the principal whenever she desired. The broken mug on the floor was not a tragedy to her. It was merely proof of my insubordination. My chest heaved as I struggled to pull air into my lungs. The adrenaline rush peaked and began a rapid, sickening descent. I was shaking. My hands trembled violently and my knees felt weak. The sheer ferocity of her delusion terrified me. I realized with chilling clarity that reasoning with her was a biological impossibility. She would rather burn my life to ash than admit she was wrong. I backed away from her. I did not deliver a final cinematic parting line. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen, leaving my muddy footprints and the shattered pieces of Dutch Harbor on her floor. I pulled open the heavy oak door and practically ran down the concrete walkway to my truck. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and rested my forehead against the freezing steering wheel. I was shaking uncontrollably, sickened by my own destructive outburst and overwhelmed by the monstrous reality of her entitlement. I drove away from her subdivision, my mind racing. I had confronted her hoping to force an immediate resolution or a confession. Instead, I had proven that she would never willingly relinquish her grip on my identity. The civil dispute was escalating into an unwinnable war. I realized that handling this within the family was no longer an option. The infection was too deep, the justifications too entrenched. I needed external force to sever the ties she had woven. I needed a mechanism stronger than a locked door or a shouted argument. I needed the law. But seeking legal intervention would introduce me to a bureaucratic nightmare that moved slower than the Alaskan winter, forcing me into an entirely new arena of vulnerability while the machine decided my fate. I drove away from the shattered ceramic on my mother's floor and headed straight toward the glass and steel towers of downtown Anchorage. The frantic adrenaline that fueled my outburst had burned off, leaving behind a cold, mechanical determination. I parked my mud-stained truck in a heated underground garage alongside imported luxury sedans and rode the silent elevator to the 14th floor. I believed I was taking the final decisive step to reclaim my life. I assumed the legal system functioned like a scalpel, ready to sever the fraudulent ties and restore my accounts with a few strokes of a judge's pen. I expected to walk out of that building with a temporary injunction, a document that would force the commercial lender to release my sponsor money and bar Diane from my business profile. The law office was a study in sterile power. The floors were polished mahogany, the air smelled of ozone and expensive coffee, and the acoustic paneling absorbed every sound. I sat across a wide, uncluttered desk from a senior attorney specializing in corporate fraud. He possessed the pragmatic, detached demeanor of a man who reviews financial ruin every day before lunch. I laid out the surviving paperwork. I walked him through the corporate charter. Diane had manipulated the shadow loan, dragging my production company into default, the cross-collateralization seizure that emptied my checking account, and the decade of intercepted state dividends routed into the fictitious survivor trust. He did not interrupt me. He reviewed the state ledgers and the commercial loan agreements, tracing the routing numbers with the silver tip of his pen. When I finished my explanation, I asked him how quickly we could file the injunction to unfreeze my operating funds. He set the pen down and folded his hands over the documents. He did not offer a swift victory. Instead, he delivered a harsh dose of legal reality that dismantled my entire strategy. I explained that we were not dealing with a local dispute or a simple case of unauthorized credit card use, because the commercial lender who issued the shadow loan was headquartered in another state, and because Diane had utilized internet portals and interstate banking servers to intercept the state dividends, the jurisdiction bypassed the Anchorage Police Department entirely. Local law enforcement lacked the authority to compel out-of-state financial institutions to release seized assets. My mother had unknowingly elevated her theft into the realm of federal wire fraud and interstate identity theft. To pursue any meaningful action, the attorney explained, we had to surrender the case to the federal government. Specifically, we had to compile the evidence into a comprehensive dossier and submit it to the Internet Crime Complaint Center, a specialized division that feeds data directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I asked him what that process entailed. I wanted to know the timeline. I needed my sponsor money released so I could pay my cabin rent and buy firewood for the impending freeze. The attorney leaned back in his leather chair and outlined a bureaucratic nightmare. The federal government does not operate on the frantic schedule of family drama. To initiate a federal inquiry, my entire digital and financial footprint would have to be packaged and handed over to forensic analysts. I was required to surrender my physical hard drives. Those drives contained years of unedited wilderness footage, proprietary brand assets, and my entire livelihood. I had to provide my personal smartphones, my tax returns, spanning more than a decade, and unredacted bank statements showing every purchase I had ever made. My life was about to become an open crime scene. Every digital conversation, every vendor payment, and every location tag would be scrutinized by faceless agents in a sterile lab thousands of miles away. I was the victim, yet I was required to prove my innocence by relinquishing every shred of my privacy. Worse than the invasion of privacy was the timeline. The attorney looked me in the eye and told me to prepare for months of agonizing silence. The bureaucratic machine grinds forward at an excruciating pace. Agents would need to secure subpoenas for the commercial lender review, the IP addresses used to access the state dividend portal, and build an airtight matrix of evidence before a federal prosecutor would even consider drafting an indictment. During that investigative period, my business accounts had to remain locked. The attorney explicitly warned me against attempting to negotiate with the commercial lender or opening new corporate entities, as any sudden financial maneuvering could be construed by federal investigators as an attempt to obscure assets or interfere with the audit. I was legally mandated to remain bankrupt. I sat in the plush leather chair listening to the hum of the climate control system. The illusion of a swift legal rescue evaporated. I was entirely exposed. The very institutions designed to protect citizens from fraud were now demanding my total submission and offering zero immediate relief. I asked the attorney a simple practical question. I asked him how I was supposed to eat. I asked him how I was supposed to fuel my truck or keep my wood stove burning while I waited half a year for a government agency to decide if my stolen identity was worth prosecuting. He offered a sympathetic nod, a hollow gesture that provided no warmth. He told me I had to find a way to survive the interim. The law offers eventual justice, not immediate rescue. I left the mahogany office and rode the silent elevator back down to the concrete garage. I climbed into my freezing truck. My primary checking account held roughly $400. My credit profile was radiating red flags, meaning I could not secure a personal loan or even a low-limit credit card. I had to generate untraceable immediate cash to weather the Alaskan winter while the federal gears slowly began to turn. That is how a successful wilderness content creator ended up driving to the coastal town of Whittier the very next morning. I stripped off my premium outdoor gear and traded it for heavy insulated rubber waders and thick industrial gloves. I secured a job at a commercial seafood processing plant. They hired seasonal labor with minimal paperwork, paying an hourly wage for grueling physical exertion. The environment was brutal. The plant was a cavernous, echoing warehouse kept at near-freezing temperatures to preserve the catch. The air hung thick with the metallic smell of blood-salt water and industrial bleach. For 10 hours a day, I stood shoulder to shoulder with transient workers on a metal grate operating a sharp knife on a moving conveyor belt. I gutted flatfish and halibut, removing entrails and preparing the meat for flash freezing. The repetitive motion sent sharp, agonizing pain shooting up my forearms and into my neck. Ice water splashed against my chest, seeping through the microscopic cracks in the rubber gear, chilling my skin. I spent my days carving up dead fish, and my nights sitting in my dry cabin near Palmer staring at the flames in my wood stove. I was living a stark, punishing dual existence. I had to preserve my professional reputation online, requiring me to occasionally post archived video content or carefully worded text updates to maintain the illusion of a thriving career. I hid my physical exhaustion and my financial terror from my audience, my friends, and my sponsors. Every dollar I earned on the processing floor went toward buying split birchwood and basic dried goods. The grueling physical labor was a punishing reminder of my vulnerability. Diane was sitting in a heated home in Wasilla, enjoying the comforts purchased with my credit while I was scrubbing fish scales out of my fingernails just to survive the mess she engineered. The resentment hardened into a cold, dense core inside my chest. I focused entirely on the repetitive slice of the knife, waiting for the federal complaint to take root. Just as the grueling rhythm of the processing plant began to feel like a permanent sentence, a new variable crashed into my fragile routine. I was walking out of the Whittier plant after a grueling 14-hour shift, the sky dark and the wind howling off the Prince William Sound. I climbed into my truck, turned the key, and watched my phone illuminate in the cup holder. The caller ID displayed the name of my older brother. Luke rarely called me unless directed by our mother. He operated on a strict rotation, spending 2 weeks working on a remote oil rig on the North Slope before returning to his affluent life in Anchorage. I stared at the glowing screen, listening to the engine idle. The federal investigation was supposed to be a secret, a silent trap slowly closing around Diane. But Luke was calling, and his sudden appearance signaled that the protective silence had broken. I answered the call, unaware that my brother was flying south, not to offer comfort, but to deliver a bribe that would rip the remaining fabric of my family entirely to shreds. The glow of my phone screen illuminated the dark cab of my truck as the icy wind off Prince William Sound battered the windshield. I stared at the caller identification. Luke. We rarely spoke outside of forced holiday dinners or the mandated check-ins orchestrated by our mother. My older brother operates on a rigid 2-week schedule, working as a drilling supervisor on an isolated oil rig up on the North Slope. That environment breeds a specific type of Alaskan resident. The men who endure the isolation and extreme cold of the slope are compensated with massive 6-figure salaries. Luke had always leveraged his income to insulate himself from the financial desperation that drove Diane to commit fraud. To the outside world, and to me for most of my life, he was the stable, successful golden child who had outgrown the trauma of the Bering Sea. I swiped the green icon to accept the call. The connection was brittle, laced with static. Luke did not ask about my physical health or the status of my business. His tone carried the frantic, compressed energy of a man accustomed to issuing orders and seeing them executed instantly. He told me his rotation ended that morning, and he had flown south to Anchorage. He demanded I meet him at a specific 24-hour diner in Eagle River, a town positioned roughly halfway between my cabin and Palmer and the city limits. He said it was an emergency regarding our mother. I spent the 40-minute drive navigating treacherous patches of black ice on the Glen Highway, running various scenarios through my exhausted mind. I assumed Diane had broken down and confessed her theft to him, painting me as an unforgiving daughter, intent on ruining the family over a simple accounting error. I anticipated a lecture on family loyalty. I expected him to invoke our father's memory, to guilt me into withdrawing the bank disputes, to protect Diane from the consequences of her actions. I braced myself for the emotional weight of his judgment. I parked outside the diner. The neon sign buzzed, casting a harsh red light across the snowbanks. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and industrial frying grease. I spotted Luke sitting in a vinyl booth near the back wearing a heavy, expensive parka. He looked exhausted. Dark circles underscored his eyes, and he kept checking the screen of his smartwatch. I slid into the booth across from him. The waitress dropped 2 thick mugs of black coffee on the table and retreated. Luke did not waste time with pleasantries. He reached inside his jacket, pulled out a thick envelope, and slid it across the sticky laminate surface toward me. He tapped his index finger against the paper. I opened the envelope. Inside rested a certified cashier's check issued by a major national bank. The payee line bore my name. The amount was printed in crisp, bold numerals, $14,000. The exact sum Diane had charged to my locked corporate credit card for the Maui flights. Luke leaned forward, lowering his voice to a harsh, commanding whisper. "Deposit the funds tomorrow morning," he said. "Clear the balance on the corporate card. Call the bank and withdraw the dispute. Then withdraw whatever federal complaint you filed against Mom. We are handling this internally. The issue is resolved." I looked at the piece of paper. It felt like a test of my fundamental morality. He was offering a clean, immediate exit from the grueling reality of the Whittier processing plant. With that check, I could theoretically unfreeze my corporate accounts, resume my brand sponsorships, and avoid the devastating months of federal audits. I could retreat to my off-grid cabin and pretend the theft was merely a terrible nightmare. It was the quintessential red herring designed to distract me with immediate relief while obscuring the true depth of the deception. But I possessed information Luke did not know I had. During my frantic caffeine-fueled audit of my financial profile 2 weeks prior, I had not stopped at discovering the principal amount of the $45,000 shadow loan Diane took out in my company's name. The raw numbers were not enough. I needed to understand the mechanics of the theft. I had requested detailed transaction logs from the commercial lender, meticulously tracing the flow of every dollar. I discovered that the funds did not simply disappear into a generic checking account. The $45,000 was routed to a holding ledger controlled by Diane. From that ledger, she executed a series of calculated outbound wire transfers. The initial disbursements covered the down payments on her luxury snowmobiles and funded her upscale dining habits in Anchorage. That accounted for roughly half the loan. The remaining balance, a sum of $20,000, was not spent on her comfort. It was wired in 3 distinct tranches to a series of obscure international routing numbers. The destination accounts were registered banking havens commonly utilized by unregulated digital casinos and sports betting syndicates. My golden child brother, the man who flaunted his massive oil rig salary and judged my unconventional wilderness career, harbored a crippling addiction. The intense isolation and high-pressure environment of the North Slope had driven him deep into the world of illicit offshore sports gambling. He had drained his own substantial income and amassed a massive debt to unregulated bookmakers. When the collectors demanded payment, Luke did not face the consequences of his actions. He turned to the woman who believed that money was the ultimate weapon against death. Diane did not have $20,000 in liquid cash to rescue her son, but she possessed the fraudulent capability to extract it from my pristine credit profile. She secured the commercial shadow loan using my production company as the collateral, jeopardizing my entire livelihood to settle Luke's gambling debts and protect his flawless reputation. I sat in the diner booth staring at the man across from me. The realization reshaped the entire architecture of the conflict. Luke was not flying south to act as a noble mediator. He was not trying to protect our mother from a harsh legal system. He was attempting to buy his own survival. If the federal investigators from the Internet Crime Complaint Center continued their audit of the shadow loan, they would inevitably trace the $20,000 outbound wire directly to his offshore gambling accounts. The audit would expose him as the primary beneficiary of the wire fraud. He was not a concerned bystander. He was a complicit co-conspirator in a federal crime. The $14,000 cashier's check was not an act of sibling generosity. It was hush money. He was terrified that my refusal to absorb the airline charges would trigger a deeper investigation that would drag him out of his insulated high-income life and into a federal courtroom. He needed me to withdraw the complaints to extinguish the paper trail leading to his own corruption. I looked at the check, then looked up at my brother. The arrogance radiating from his posture was sickening. He fully expected me to snatch the money and express profound gratitude for his intervention. He believed my financial desperation would override my need for justice. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl accusations across the diner table or expose my knowledge of the offshore wires. Engaging in a screaming match would only validate his belief that he could manage my reactions. I picked up the cashier's check. I held it between my thumb and forefinger. Then I slowly, deliberately tore the heavy paper exactly in half. I placed the torn pieces back on the laminate table and slid them toward him. "You cannot buy your way out of a federal audit, Luke," I said. My tone was flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "The complaint is filed. The data is secured. The machine is already moving." The color drained from his face. The confident, commanding supervisor from the North Slope vanished, replaced by a terrified man who realized his wealth could no longer shield him from the incoming storm. He opened his mouth to argue, to issue a threat, but the absolute finality in my posture silenced him. I stood up from the booth, leaving the torn check and the untouched coffee behind. I walked out of the diner and back into the freezing Alaskan night. I had definitively rejected the bribe and severed the last remaining tie to my family. I had sealed their fate and cemented my own commitment to the grueling federal process. I climbed into my truck, bracing myself for the punishing months ahead. I believed that rejecting Luke's money was the hardest test of my resolve. I did not realize that the isolation of the investigation would force me to construct a suffocating double life, pushing my psychological endurance to the absolute breaking point as I waited for the invisible gears of justice to finally catch their targets. I left the torn cashier's check on the diner table and walked out into the freezing parking lot. I did not look back at the illuminated windows to see my brother's reaction. Leaving that money behind severed the last frayed thread connecting me to my family. I had definitively rejected their attempts to manage the fallout. My refusal guaranteed that the federal investigation would move forward unchecked, dragging Diane and Luke into the harsh light of a courtroom. But my moral victory did not pay the rent on my Palmer cabin, and it certainly did not unfreeze my corporate accounts. The following 3 months forced me into a brutal state of suspended animation. The federal attorney had warned me that the bureaucratic process moves at a glacial pace. Forensic accountants at the Internet Crime Complaint Center were meticulously dissecting the cross-collateralization records, the state dividend ledgers, and the offshore wire transfers. I was legally barred from attempting to untangle the mess myself, or negotiating with the commercial lender, as any financial movement could be interpreted as tampering with an active federal audit. My production company was functionally paralyzed, locked in a digital holding pattern while faceless agents built their matrix of evidence. I was trapped in a financial purgatory. To survive the punishing Alaskan winter without access to my frozen assets, I had to maintain my grueling schedule at the Whittier processing plant. 5 days a week, I drove the long stretch of highway to the coast. I pulled on the heavy rubber waders smelling of old blood and industrial bleach, and took my place on the metal grating. For 10 hours a day, I stood in the freezing warehouse wielding a sharp knife against an endless conveyor belt of flatfish. The repetitive motion sent sharp spikes of pain through my forearms, while ice water constantly splashed against my chest. Every dollar I earned from that physical misery went directly toward securing split birch wood to keep the stove in my cabin burning and purchasing the bare minimum of dry goods to keep myself fed. But the grueling manual labor was only half of the ordeal. The true agony of those 3 months was the psychological toll of constructing and maintaining a seamless double life. My career as a wilderness content creator relied entirely on projecting an image of rugged independence and capable survival. My audience tuned in to watch me master the elements testing gear and navigating the isolated beauty of the backcountry. My sponsors, even the ones who had paused their contracts due to the automated banking flags, monitored my online presence closely. I could not allow the public to see the terrified, bankrupt woman scrubbing fish scales out of her fingernails. I had to project absolute stability, ensuring that when the federal indictments finally cleared my name, my professional brand would still be intact and viable. The contrast between my reality and my required projection was agonizing. After finishing a grueling shift at the processing plant, I would peel off the foul-smelling rubber gear, wash my hands until they were raw, and drive out to the Chugach Mountains. I would hike 2 miles into the dense spruce forest, carrying heavy camera equipment through deep snow. I would set up the tripod, force my exhausted facial muscles into a bright, confident expression, and hit record. I filmed vlogs demonstrating advanced winter shelter construction and ice fishing techniques. I spoke to the camera with enthusiasm, detailing the specific thermal ratings of outdoor apparel, while my own hands shook, not from the freezing temperature, but from the crushing, vibrating stress of secretly collaborating with federal investigators. I smiled while explaining the beauty of the remote landscape, actively burying the terror that the commercial lender might initiate foreclosure proceedings on my business assets before the IC3 finished their review. I would return to my dry cabin late at night, light the wood stove, and upload the polished footage using a satellite connection. I responded to comments from followers praising my adventurous lifestyle while I ate plain rice and stared at a bank balance that hovered dangerously close to zero. If you have ever had to paste on a professional smile and project absolute competence while your private world was collapsing around you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Leave a comment below if you have ever carried that specific weight. It is a unique kind of exhaustion that seeps past your muscles and rewires your fundamental DNA. It isolates you completely, forcing you to lie to everyone who supports you in order to protect the very foundation of your life. This suffocating dual existence demanded absolute discipline. I communicated with the assigned federal investigator through encrypted channels, providing supplemental documentation regarding the offshore wire transfers Luke had initiated. I maintained absolute radio silence with Diane and Luke, ignoring their intermittent, escalating text messages that ranged from syrupy pleas for reconciliation to harsh threats of familial excommunication. I absorbed the isolation, focusing entirely on surviving the present moment so the future could eventually be secured. The endless cycle of gutting fish and faking enthusiasm ground my resilience down to a fine dust. The deep winter darkness of Alaska amplified the despair, making every day feel like an insurmountable obstacle. I was running on fumes, desperately waiting for the federal machinery to produce a tangible result. I needed the investigation to conclude before the financial strain broke my spirit or forced me to abandon my cabin. Just as the grueling routine began to feel like a permanent, inescapable sentence, a sudden disruption threatened to collapse the fragile boundaries I had built. February arrived, bringing a slight shift in the light and a massive surge of activity to the region. Anchorage was preparing to host the Fur Rendezvous, an iconic winter festival that serves as a massive cultural and economic hub for the state, drawing tourists, politicians, and corporate executives from across the country. I had deliberately avoided all social and professional events, claiming I was deep in production on a remote project. My strategy was to remain entirely invisible. I believed that staying hidden in Palmer and Whittier would insulate me from any further manipulation attempts by my family while the investigation ran its course. I was wrong. My mother had not retreated after I locked the door, and Luke failed to deliver the bribe. She had merely changed tactics. Diane understood that attacking me directly with demands or threats was no longer effective. She knew my vulnerability was entirely financial. She calculated that if she could offer a solution that simultaneously saved my business and absolved her of the federal crimes, my exhaustion would override my need for justice. The trap did not arrive as an aggressive confrontation or a tearful apology. It arrived as a digital notification on my phone while I was hauling a load of birch logs through the snow. Diane sent me a VIP pass to an exclusive sponsor gala being held at the prestigious Hotel Captain Cook in downtown Anchorage. The message attached to the pass was brief, devoid of emotion, and chillingly precise. She claimed she had secured a solution to the banking error. She stated a major outdoor apparel brand wanted to sign me to a lucrative representation contract. She told me to attend the gala that evening. I stood in the snow, holding the heavy logs, staring at the screen. The offer was a direct hit to my most desperate need. A major contract could unfreeze my life, provide immediate capital to cover my rent, and allow me to quit the processing plant. It was the exact lifeline I was starving for dangling right in front of me. I did not realize that walking into that glittering ballroom would force me into the most agonizing internal battle of my entire life, testing my endurance against a temptation designed perfectly to exploit my exhaustion. The glow of the text message seemed unnaturally bright against the backdrop of the dark spruce trees surrounding my cabin. I dropped the heavy birch logs into the snow. The VIP pass was a digital ticket to the most exclusive event of the Anchorage winter season. The Fur Rendezvous, known locally as Fur Rondi, is not merely a festival. It is a massive economic engine. It transforms the city into a hub of networking, drawing corporate sponsors, rugged outdoor brands, and political figures, leading up to the ceremonial start of the Iditarod sled dog race. Gaining entry to the elite sponsor galas during this week is incredibly difficult. Diane had not just secured a ticket, she had weaponized the entire event. Her text message was calculated with surgical precision. I found a solution to the bank error. A major brand wants to sign you. Come tonight. She knew my primary sponsor had paused my contract. She knew the cross-collateralization had drained my checking account. She likely assumed my silence meant I was struggling, breaking under the weight of the financial freeze. She was dangling a massive immediate payout precisely when she knew my endurance was nearly shattered. I walked back into my cabin and stared at the wood stove. I was so deeply exhausted. The physical pain from gutting flatfish in Whittier was a constant dull ache in my shoulders. The psychological strain of maintaining a confident online persona while secretly cooperating with federal agents had hollowed me out. The prospect of an immediate cash infusion, a legitimate contract that could instantly resolve the commercial default and unfreeze my production company, was agonizingly tempting. I told myself I was only going to gather information. I justified the decision by reasoning that observing her tactics in person might yield useful details for the IC3 investigator. But underneath the rationalization, a desperate, exhausted part of my brain wanted the lifeline to be real. I wanted the struggle to end. I washed the lingering smell of bleach and fish from my hands using water heated on the stove. I put on the only formal dress I owned, a heavy dark wool garment suited for the Alaskan climate, and paired it with practical leather boots. I drove the long stretch of the Glen Highway toward Anchorage, the city lights reflecting off the low cloud cover. The Hotel Captain Cook is a landmark of old Alaskan wealth, its lobby lined with dark wood and maritime artwork. The ballroom was packed. Men in tailored suits and women in elegant evening wear mingled with rugged dog mushers and corporate executives. Waiters navigated the crowded floor, carrying trays of champagne and expensive appetizers. The sheer opulence of the room contrasted sharply with the bleak, freezing reality of my dry cabin and the processing plant. It was an environment designed to project power and stability. I stood near the entrance, scanning the crowd. Diane spotted me immediately. She was holding a crystal flute, wearing a stunning designer gown that fit the upscale environment perfectly. She did not look like a woman currently under federal investigation for wire fraud. She looked established, unbothered, and entirely in control. She navigated through the crowd and greeted me warmly. She did not mention the shattered coffee mug or the screaming match in her kitchen. She did not mention the torn cashier's check Luke had offered. She embraced me lightly, playing the role of the proud, supportive mother managing her successful daughter's career. Her performance was flawless, designed to reassure any onlookers that our family dynamic was intact and thriving. "I am so glad you came, Claire," she said, her voice smooth and modulated for the audience. "We have a very important introduction to make." She placed a hand on my lower back and guided me through the throng of executives toward a private reserved table positioned near a massive ice sculpture. A man in a sharp charcoal suit stood up as we approached. He had the slick, polished demeanor of a high-level public relations executive. Diane introduced him as a senior talent representative working on behalf of a major international outdoor apparel brand, a competitor to the sponsor who had recently paused my contract. The executive shook my hand firmly and offered me a seat. He did not waste time with small talk. He launched directly into a pitch praising my wilderness content and my authentic connection with the Alaskan demographic. He spoke rapidly, using industry buzzwords about brand synergy and market penetration. He reached inside his leather portfolio and withdrew a thick, professionally bound document. He slid it across the white tablecloth toward me. It was a formal representation agreement. "This is a year-long exclusive partnership," he explained, his tone confident and reassuring. "We are prepared to offer a substantial signing bonus effectively and advance on your representation. The capital is designed to clear any current financial hurdles you might be facing and provide the runway necessary to elevate your production quality. We handle the administrative overhead, and you focus entirely on the backcountry content." I looked at the cover page, then flipped to the compensation schedule. The numbers printed on the heavy stock paper were staggering. It was a life-changing amount of money. The upfront cash advance was more than enough to completely pay off the delinquent $45,000 shadow loan Diane had originated. It would unfreeze my primary LLC, allow me to immediately quit the punishing manual labor in Whittier, and secure my cabin rent for the next 5 years. I looked across the table at Diane. She was watching me read the figures. Her expression was a masterclass in subtle manipulation. She allowed a look of genuine maternal pride to soften her features. She nodded slightly silently, encouraging me to accept the offer. It was a powerful, intoxicating illusion. For a fleeting moment, sitting in the warmth of the luxurious ballroom, I felt the intense gravity of her proposed reality. She was offering to fix the very disaster she had created, presenting herself not as a thief, but as a ruthless protector who could leverage her connections to secure my future. This was the solution. It was the exact perfect lifeline I had been starving for, presented on a silver platter in front of witnesses. It required no federal audits, no waiting for bureaucratic gears to turn, and no further physical agony on the processing line. It promised immediate safety and a return to the career I loved. The sheer relief the contract offered was a physical sensation, loosening the tight, panicked knot that had lived in my chest for the past month. All I had to do was accept the narrative she had constructed. All I had to do was view the stolen dividends and the fraudulent commercial loan as unconventional business strategies rather than felonies. I placed my hands flat on the white tablecloth, my fingertips resting against the edge of the bound document. The music from the string quartet seemed to fade into the background. The chatter of the executives blurred into white noise. I was suspended in a critical vacuum, staring at the numbers that could instantly erase my suffering. I believe the most difficult part of this ordeal was surviving the physical cold and the financial ruin. I did not realize that the true test of my endurance was sitting right in front of me, forcing me into an agonizing internal battle against my own desperate instinct for survival. The executive handed me a sleek, heavy silver pen and gestured toward the signature line on the final page. The ballroom hummed with the energy of high-level commerce, a sharp contrast to the stark, silent isolation of my cabin. I did not immediately take the pen. I asked the executive for a moment to review the specific deliverables outlined in the appendix. He offered a polite, accommodating smile, signaled to a passing waiter for another round of drinks, and stepped away from the table to give me space. I picked up the bound contract and a glass of ice water. I walked away from the immediate pressure of the private table, navigating through the crowd toward a quieter corner of the ballroom near a massive, intricately carved ice sculpture of a sled dog team. The ambient temperature was noticeably cooler near the carving, grounding me slightly. I set the glass down on a tall cocktail table. The condensation immediately pooled against the crisp white linen. I opened the document and stared at the compensation figures again. The numbers were not just a solution to my current crisis. They represented a level of financial security I had never achieved on my own. The advance payment alone would instantly clear the delinquent shadow loan, releasing the automated banking hold on my primary accounts. It would provide enough capital to secure a multi-year lease on my cabin, upgrade my backcountry filming equipment, and completely sever my reliance on the grueling labor at the processing plant. For 10 agonizing minutes, standing in the periphery of that glittering room, I seriously considered accepting the deal. The physical and psychological exhaustion I had endured over the past month felt like heavy, wet sand in my lungs. My arms still ached from the repetitive motion of the processing line. The pervasive cold of the dry cabin was a constant, draining reality. I was tired of fighting an invisible bureaucratic war. I was exhausted by the relentless vigilance required to maintain my double life. I looked across the expansive room and found Diane. She had rejoined a circle of prominent local politicians and corporate sponsors. She held her champagne flute with casual elegance, laughing effortlessly at a joke. She projected an aura of absolute invulnerability. She looked so entrenched, so deeply woven into the fabric of the city's power structure. The contrast between her effortless stability and my desperate, shivering reality was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. If I signed the paper in my hands, the war would end instantly. I could contact the IC3 investigator tomorrow morning and formally withdraw my complaint, citing a resolved family misunderstanding. I could inform the commercial lender that the shadow loan was being paid in full. I could resume my wilderness vlogs without the underlying terror of impending bankruptcy. I could finally have a semblance of a normal, functioning relationship with my mother. We could attend holiday dinners without the specter of federal indictments hanging over the table. The temptation to simply fold was overpowering. The human instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to take the golden handcuffs. The path of least resistance offered warmth, security, and an end to the brutal manual labor. It demanded only one concession: I had to accept her narrative. I had to acknowledge that her method of survival, her ruthless commandeering of my identity, was acceptable. I had to become the compliant, manageable daughter she had always demanded. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air near the ice sculpture fill my lungs. I closed my eyes for a brief second, trying to silence the loud, desperate voice of my own exhaustion. I forced myself to look past the alluring compensation schedule on the first page. I turned the thick paper, analyzing the structural mechanics of the agreement with the same meticulous scrutiny I applied to planning a remote backcountry route. I was an experienced content creator. I had negotiated dozens of brand partnerships before. I knew how standard representation agreements were drafted. I reached the final section of the document, designated for liability waivers and non-disclosure provisions. My eyes scanned the dense legalistic formatting. As I read the specific clauses, the warm, seductive illusion of rescue shattered entirely. Buried deep within the dense paragraphs was a highly irregular stipulation. The contract explicitly required me, as the signatory, to formally assume all prior debts and financial liabilities currently associated with my production LLC. It mandated that I drop any pending banking disputes, fraud claims, or active investigations regarding unauthorized corporate expenditures as a strict condition of the partnership. Furthermore, it included an ironclad non-disclosure agreement prohibiting me from discussing the origin or management of those specific debts with any external parties, including law enforcement. The slick PR executive had not presented a standard talent representation agreement. He had presented a legally binding gag order. The firm he represented was not acting on behalf of a major international outdoor brand. A legitimate corporation would never absorb the risk of a creator tangled in active fraud disputes, nor would they dictate the resolution of internal LLC liabilities. The firm was a shell entity. Diane and her network had constructed a corporate backdoor designed to systematically launder the fraudulent shadow loan. If I signed that final page, I was not simply securing a lucrative sponsorship. I was legally authenticating the shell company. By formally assuming the debt in exchange for the advance, I would be legally reclassifying the fraudulent $45,000 commercial loan as a legitimate accepted business expense. I would be washing the federal crimes entirely clean, erasing the paper trail that the IC3 investigators were currently tracing. I would transform myself from a victim of interstate wire fraud into a willing participant in a complex financial cover-up. The fleeting moment of maternal pride Diane had displayed at the table was not an expression of love or support. It was a highly calculated sales tactic. She had accurately identified my absolute lowest point of endurance and deployed a tailored extraction strategy. She was not offering to save my life. She was demanding I sacrifice my legal standing to guarantee her own survival. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The intense temptation to surrender vanished, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. I was standing in a room full of powerful people, holding the exact mechanism designed to ensure my permanent subjugation. I did not realize that the hardest part of the evening was not resisting the money, but executing the precise, calculated maneuver required to weaponize her own trap against her without triggering the alarm. The fine print on the final page of the document required intense focus to decipher. The legal phrasing was dense and deliberately convoluted. I read the specific paragraph detailing the release of claims. It outlined a mandatory assumption of all pre-existing corporate debt currently associated with my production company. It mandated the immediate cessation of all formal banking inquiries and fraud disputes. The text explicitly required me to hold the authorized signers of the limited liability company harmless from any past financial actions. The man sitting at this table was not representing a major international outdoor brand. The public relations firm listed on the header was an empty vessel. It was a paper construct built by my mother and a local broker specializing in high-risk commercial maneuvers. Anchorage is a small city hiding behind the facade of a major metropolis. The business community operates on tight, interconnected networks where favors are traded quietly. Diane had found someone willing to draft a fraudulent representation contract to launder her commercial default. By signing the advance agreement, I would legally absorb the shadow loan into a legitimate marketing expense. I would sanitize her crime and rewrite the history of the theft. What my mother did not understand about modern federal investigations is the level of real-time surveillance available to victims. 3 weeks prior, an investigator from the Internet Crime Complaint Center had warned me about this exact scenario. He told me that perpetrators of familial financial crimes often panic when the banking holds tighten and the automated seizures begin to affect their daily lives. He advised me to document any sudden attempts at reconciliation or unusual financial propositions. He provided a specific protocol for capturing these interactions without violating state recording statutes. When I first arrived at the private table near the ice sculpture, I had placed my phone face up next to my water glass. It looked like the casual gesture of an influencer, keeping her notifications visible during a meeting. It was actually a highly calibrated audio transmission. The screen was dim, but the microphone was active. The voice memo application was recording every spoken word and syncing the audio directly to a secure government cloud drive. The federal agent assigned to my case was receiving the transmission in real time. Every promise of upfront cash, every description of the signing bonus, and every manipulative reassurance Diane offered had been captured and preserved on a federal server. I held the physical proof of extortion in my hands. The contract was the missing link the federal prosecutors needed to elevate the case from suspected wire fraud to active witness tampering and corporate money laundering. I did not need to sign the document, I just needed to secure the paper. I walked back towards the private table. The string quartet was playing a fast classical arrangement that drifted over the low murmur of the crowded ballroom. The public relations executive saw me approaching and smiled. He picked up the heavy silver pen and extended his arm, offering it to me. He expected compliance. He assumed the allure of the signing bonus and the desperate reality of my financial freeze had eroded my defenses. Diane was sitting next to him, sipping champagne from a crystal flute. She looked up at me with an expression of profound satisfaction. She believed she had successfully managed the crisis. She thought she had purchased my silence and secured her own freedom using a shell company budget. She looked safe and established among the local politicians and corporate sponsors. I did not accept the silver pen. I stood at the edge of the table holding the bound contract. The noise of the ballroom felt distant and muted. I looked at the executive. I told him I would not be executing the agreement today or any other day. His professional demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second. He lowered the pen and began to recite a rehearsed script about the limited duration of the offer and the competitive nature of the outdoor apparel market. He warned me that walking away from this specific capital advance would severely limit my production capabilities and leave my business exposed to further market risks. He used sharp corporate language designed to incite panic and force a hasty signature. I ignored his pitch entirely. I turned my attention directly to Diane. She placed her champagne flute on the white linen tablecloth. The smug satisfaction drained from her features, replaced by a rigid tension that tightened the corners of her mouth. She opened her mouth to speak. She was preparing to issue a command disguised as maternal advice to remind me of the stakes and pressure me into submission. I did not let her form the words. I leaned forward slightly. I kept my voice low and devoid of any theatrical emotion. I did not scream. I did not create a public spectacle for the executives and local politicians to witness. I refused to give her the satisfaction of portraying me as the unstable daughter ruining a professional networking event. I delivered a single sentence: I am not your human shield. I did not toss the contract onto the table. I did not storm away empty-handed. I calmly folded the thick document in half, creasing the heavy paper straight down the middle. I opened my leather purse and slid the paperwork inside next to my wallet. The executive protested immediately. He reached across the table and told me the document was proprietary and confidential. He demanded I return the physical copy to him at once. I looked at his outstretched hand. I told him the document was now evidence. I turned around and walked away from the table. I navigated through the crowded ballroom, bypassing the ornate ice sculptures and the trays of expensive appetizers circulating among the guests. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the hotel lobby and stepped out into the freezing Anchorage night. The bitter winter wind hit my face, carrying the sharp scent of exhaust fumes and falling snow. The cold air rushed into my lungs and cleared the lingering fog of the opulent ballroom. I walked toward my parked truck with a steady, measured pace. I was exhausted, but the crushing weight of the past month had finally lifted. I had survived the hardest internal battle of my life. I had stared at financial salvation and recognized it as a cage. I had the smoking gun of federal extortion secured in my bag. The audio recording of the shell company pitch was safely stored on a government server. I had handed the federal investigators the exact key they needed to tear down the fraudulent architecture my mother had built. I turned the ignition of my truck and drove north toward the Matanuska Valley. The waiting period was over. The trap was set and the bureaucratic gears were locked in place. I knew the federal government was preparing to execute a silent, devastating raid that would dismantle her pristine life forever. The transition from winter to spring in Alaska is a slow, grueling thaw. The snow turns to heavy slush and the birch trees stand stark against gray skies. I spent the 6 weeks following the Fur Rendezvous Gala in absolute isolation at my cabin. The silence from the federal investigators was profound. I continued my brutal shifts at the Whittier processing plant, saving every dollar to keep my wood stove burning, while the unsigned shell company contract rested in a secure evidence locker in downtown Anchorage. The anticipation was a constant low-level hum in my blood. I knew the machine was moving, but federal operations do not broadcast their schedules to the victims. The resolution of a massive wire fraud case rarely looks like a cinematic action sequence. There are no helicopters circling overhead, no armored vehicles smashing through suburban gates, and no agents shouting through bullhorns. True financial devastation arrives quietly wearing a suit and carrying a clipboard. It happened on a damp, overcast Tuesday morning in late April. I was 50 miles north of Palmer, standing in a muddy dog yard in Willow. The Iditarod Trail cuts right through this area, and many local mushers use the spring thaw to train their yearling huskies on soft trails before the summer heat sets in. I was helping a close friend harness a team of eager vocal dogs to an all-terrain training cart. The physical exertion of managing the heavy harnesses and the chaotic energy of the barking dogs required my total focus. The air smelled of wet spruce needles and thawing earth. I was completely disconnected from the digital world, my phone buried deep inside the pocket of my insulated parka. While I was untangling a twisted gangline in the woods of Willow, the federal government arrived in Wasilla. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, 3 unmarked gray sedans turned off the main subdivision road and parked in a neat, unassuming line on Diane's heated concrete driveway. They did not block traffic. They did not activate flashing lights or sirens. A team of 6 plainclothes special agents assigned to the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division stepped out of the vehicles. They walked up the shoveled pathway to the heavy oak front door of the pristine house. The lead agent knocked firmly. Diane opened the door wearing her standard, impeccable morning attire, likely expecting a delivery driver or a landscaping contractor preparing for the spring thaw. The agent did not raise his voice or draw a weapon. He simply held up his credentials and handed her a thick stack of stapled paper. It was a federal search and seizure warrant signed by a magistrate judge in the district court. The warrant specifically authorized the immediate confiscation of all electronic devices, financial ledgers, tax filings, and banking correspondence located on the premises. The authorization cited probable cause for interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and attempted money laundering. Diane read the first page of the warrant. The protective illusion of her affluent, untouched life collapsed instantly. The agents did not wait for an invitation. They stepped past her into the grand foyer and immediately established a secure perimeter. The operation was methodical and ruthlessly efficient. For 4 agonizing hours, the agents systematically dismantled the administrative fortress my mother had spent 2 decades building. They moved through the vaulted living room and the pristine kitchen with the cold precision of an audit. They did not shout or tear the house apart. They simply collected data. They bagged her expensive laptop and her primary smartphone, slipping them into static-proof evidence envelopes to preserve the digital footprint of her offshore wire transfers and her correspondence with the shell company broker. They located the heavy fireproof safe hidden in her home office. Inside, they found the physical ledgers detailing the fraudulent survivor custodial trust and the forged tax documents she used to intercept my state dividends year after year. Every piece of paper that proved her theft was cataloged, boxed, and carried out to the waiting sedans. Simultaneously 40 miles south in downtown Anchorage, a secondary tactical team executed a coordinated raid. Agents entered the high-rise office suite listed on the fraudulent talent representation contract I had surrendered at the gala. They seized the servers and physical files belonging to the shady public relations broker who attempted to launder the $45,000 shadow loan. The coordinated strike neutralized the entire illicit network in a single morning. Diane watched the agents carry her life out the front door in brown cardboard boxes. The neighbors in the affluent subdivision peeked through their curtains, witnessing the steady, undeniable removal of evidence. She could not spin a narrative to explain away the presence of federal agents cataloging her financial history on the driveway. She could not blame the raid on a misunderstanding or a simple accounting glitch. The reality of her crimes was laid bare for the entire neighborhood to observe. When the search concluded, the lead agent approached Diane in her kitchen. The space where she had once demanded my compliance and shattered my father's coffee mug was now stripped of its authority. The agent informed her that based on the evidence already secured, including the recorded extortion attempt at the Fur Rendezvous Gala, she was being placed under federal arrest. They did not subject her to a dramatic, aggressive takedown. The process was sterile and deeply humiliating. They asked her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. The cold metal cuffs snapped shut around her wrists. The sound was sharp and definitive, echoing against the granite countertops. They escorted her out of the front door and down the concrete walkway. She did not struggle or shout. The sheer weight of the bureaucratic reality crushed any instinct to perform for an audience. She was placed into the back of one of the unmarked gray sedans and driven away toward the federal holding facility in Anchorage for processing and arraignment. The paper machine she thought she controlled so masterfully, the very system she believed she could manipulate to ensure her survival, had finally audited her. The math was undeniable. The offshore wires, the forged signatures, the extortion contracts, every data point aligned perfectly to secure her indictment. The fortress she built to keep the terror of the Bering Sea at bay had become her federal cage. I finished my work in the dog yard around noon. The huskies were secured on their lines, eating a meal of raw meat and kibble. I unzipped my parka, pulled my phone from the deep pocket, and saw a single missed call and a brief encrypted text message from the IC3 investigator assigned to my case. The message contained 2 words: warrant executed. I stood in the mud and the thawing snow staring at the screen. The grueling manual labor, the terrifying financial freeze, and the agonizing months of waiting had finally culminated in a tangible result. The threat was neutralized. I put the phone back in my pocket and looked at the vast, jagged peaks of the Alaska Range looming in the distance. The immediate crisis was over, but the wreckage left behind was catastrophic. My corporate accounts were still locked in default. My credit profile was a disaster zone, and I was about to navigate the brutal, complex aftermath of a federal prosecution that would test the absolute limits of my endurance and force me to execute one final devastating maneuver to reclaim the life she had stolen. The fallout from a federal indictment does not dissipate quickly. It settles over a family like heavy volcanic ash, coating every surface and choking the air long after the initial eruption. The 6 months following the raid on the Wasilla house were defined by relentless legal maneuvering, sterile conference rooms, and the grueling process of untangling my identity from the wreckage. I had to continue working sporadic shifts at the Whittier plant while simultaneously attending endless deposition prep sessions in downtown Anchorage. The physical exhaustion was matched only by the mental fatigue of explaining my own life to a rotation of federal prosecutors. Diane faced a staggering array of charges. The evidence seized during the raid was overwhelming. The forensic analysts at the Internet Crime Complaint Center had successfully matched the IP addresses from her home network to the fraudulent access logs on the state dividend portal. The physical ledgers retrieved from her fireproof safe detailed the exact routing numbers for the offshore wires that funded the sports gambling accounts. The audio recording from the Fur Rendezvous Gala provided undeniable proof of her attempt to launder the defaulted commercial loan through a shell corporation. The prosecutors had constructed an airtight matrix of data that left no room for reasonable doubt. Faced with the prospect of a prolonged, highly publicized trial that would expose her actions to the entire community she had spent decades trying to impress, Diane capitulated. The terrifying prospect of sitting in a courtroom while the prosecution dismantled her carefully constructed image of the noble grieving widow broke her resolve. She instructed her defense attorney to negotiate a settlement. In late October, as the first heavy snows began to fall across the Matanuska Valley, I sat in the gallery of the federal courthouse in Anchorage. The courtroom was paneled in dark oak and felt unnaturally quiet. I watched my mother stand before a federal judge. She wore a plain dark suit devoid of her usual expensive jewelry and carefully applied makeup. She looked diminished, stripped of the authority she used to wield so effortlessly in her pristine kitchen. The judge read the terms of the agreement. Diane officially entered a guilty plea to multiple counts of interstate wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and tax evasion. The admission of guilt hung in the cold, conditioned air of the courtroom, a stark contrast to the endless justifications and gaslighting she had deployed against me for years. The sentencing was delivered with brutal administrative precision. The judge cited the systematic, premeditated nature of the exploitation and the sheer duration of the theft as aggravating factors. Diane was sentenced to serve 24 months in a federal correctional facility. The term was mandatory, offering no possibility of early parole or home confinement. The fortress she built out of my stolen credit had finally collapsed, resulting in her absolute confinement. The legal sweep did not stop with Diane. My older brother, the golden child who had spent his life insulated by his high six-figure salary on the North Slope, found his protective shield entirely ineffective against federal scrutiny. When the investigators traced the $20,000 outbound wire from the fraudulent commercial loan directly to his offshore gambling accounts, his complicity was undeniable. The paper trail proved he was the primary beneficiary of the shadow loan. Luke was terrified. The prospect of losing his lucrative oil rig contract and facing federal prison time shattered his arrogance. He abandoned any pretense of family loyalty and immediately secured independent legal counsel. He struck a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutors, providing detailed testimony regarding the offshore betting syndicates and his knowledge of the shell company structure Diane had utilized. In exchange for his full cooperation, the prosecution agreed to forego seeking a custodial sentence. Luke was sentenced to 5 years of supervised federal probation. The terms of his probation included mandatory gambling addiction counseling, strict financial monitoring, and severe travel restrictions. His lucrative career on the slope was severely compromised due to his restricted travel status. The polished, successful image he projected to the world was irrevocably tarnished. He no longer speaks to me. Our relationship, which had always been defined by his condescension and my silent endurance, ended completely the night I tore his cashier's check in half at the Eagle River Diner. I have not received a text message or a phone call since the indictments were handed down. His silence is a sharp, necessary boundary that I accept without regret. But the most profound element of the legal resolution was not the prison sentence or the probation. It occurred during the final phase of the sentencing hearing regarding the financial restitution. The judge ordered Diane to repay the full principal amount of the $45,000 commercial shadow loan, as well as the tens of thousands of dollars she had stolen from my state dividend payouts over the past decade. Given that her assets were largely tied up in the heavily mortgaged Wasilla property and leased luxury vehicles, securing the immediate cash for restitution was impossible. The federal prosecutors implemented a specific enduring collection mechanism. The judge signed an order allowing the state of Alaska to permanently intercept Diane's future income to satisfy the debt. Every October, the state distributes the permanent fund dividend to eligible residents, fueled by the state's massive oil revenue. It is the very payout Diane had stolen from me year after year using the fabricated survivor custodial trust. The judge ruled that Diane's annual permanent fund dividend would be permanently garnished for the remainder of her natural life. The exact financial mechanism she used to exploit her daughter for a decade became the permanent unyielding instrument of her punishment. Every single year when the state announces the dividend payout amount, the funds allocated to Diane will bypass her accounts entirely and be routed directly to the federal restitution ledger. She will never see another dividend check. The money she coveted and hoarded to keep her frontier panic at bay will be systematically extracted from her by the very government she attempted to defraud. It was a stroke of absolute, breathtaking poetic justice. The ruling was not driven by vengeance or dramatic flair. It was a cold, logical application of the law designed to repair the specific damage she inflicted. I walked out of the federal courthouse that afternoon and stepped onto the busy streets of downtown Anchorage. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, but the air felt remarkably light. The legal battle was officially over. The perpetrators had been audited, sentenced, and bound by federal mandates. However, the resolution of the criminal case did not instantly repair my own life. While Diane was preparing to report to the federal facility, I was left standing in the rubble of my financial profile. The cross-collateralization freeze had been lifted by the bank following the official indictment, but my credit score was still severely damaged by the delinquent shadow loan that had sat on my record for 14 months. I was free from the immediate threat of her theft, but I was facing an uphill battle to rebuild my production company and reclaim my professional reputation in the outdoor industry. I needed to execute one final calculated maneuver to close the loop, completely transforming the wreckage she created into the foundation for my new life. I had to use the very debt that nearly bankrupted me to purchase my absolute freedom. The federal sentencing provided closure to the criminal proceedings, but a judge striking a gavel does not automatically repair a ruined credit profile. The subsequent months required a tedious, exhausting navigation through the labyrinth of American consumer finance. My credit report resembled a disaster zone. The delinquent shadow loan, the maxed-out fraudulent credit cards, and the sudden drop in my debt-to-income ratio had triggered alerts across every major reporting agency. I spent hours sitting at the small wooden table in my dry cabin, drafting endless letters of explanation to Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. I had to attach certified copies of the federal indictments and the court-ordered restitution mandate to every single correspondence fighting to prove that the catastrophic metrics attached to my name belong to a convicted felon currently residing in a federal facility. The bureaucratic cleanup was agonizingly slow, but the federal documentation functioned as an undeniable key. Once the compliance departments at the commercial banks verified the Department of Justice paperwork, the restrictive algorithms finally disengaged. The cross-collateralization freeze that had locked my primary limited liability company for nearly a year was officially lifted. The digital shackles fell away. I immediately contacted the marketing director at the Survival Gear brand. I provided the notarized federal disclosures, proving my business entity was clear of all illicit activity and commercial defaults. The corporate compliance team reviewed the file, reinstated my vendor profile, and issued a formal apology for the abrupt suspension. 3 days later, the accumulated backlog of my quarterly contract payments was wired directly into my restored checking account. I checked my balance on my phone while standing in the freezing parking lot of the Whittier processing plant. I stared at the green numbers on the screen, listening to the harsh wind whipping off the sound. I walked back inside the cavernous, bleach-scented warehouse, removed my heavy rubber waders, and handed my industrial knife back to the shift supervisor. I drove away from the coast and never returned to the processing line. I had capital again. I had my business back. But securing my own survival did not feel like a finished equation. The structural damage Diane had inflicted required a more permanent stabilizing resolution. While the federal court had ordered Diane to pay restitution to the government, the original commercial lender who issued the $45,000 shadow loan had not waited around for the slow drip of garnished state dividends. Commercial banks prioritize clean balance sheets over prolonged recovery efforts. Months prior, when the shadow loan first entered severe default, the bank wrote off the bad debt as a loss. They bundled it with hundreds of other delinquent commercial notes and auctioned the entire portfolio to a third-party collection agency. That specific piece of paper, the promissory note Diane had forged, using my company as the guarantor, still existed in the private sector. It was floating in the murky secondary market of distressed commercial debt. I did not want to simply walk away from the ashes of the theft. I recognized a unique fleeting opportunity to assert control over the very financial instrument that had nearly destroyed my life. Using a portion of my restored sponsor income, I sought out a specialized commercial debt broker operating out of downtown Anchorage. I did not hire a defense attorney. I hired a corporate acquisition proxy. I sat in his office and provided the original loan origination numbers, the dates of default, and the name of the initial commercial lender. I instructed him to track down the specific collection agency holding the distressed paper attached to Diane's name. The secondary debt market operates on steep discounts. Collection agencies purchase defaulted loans for a fraction of their face value, hoping to extract whatever they can from the debtor. The broker located the portfolio holding the shadow loan within a week. Because the debt was tied to a convicted felon currently serving time, the collection agency viewed the paper as a dead asset practically worthless and unlikely to yield any significant return. I authorized the broker to make an anonymous lowball offer on that specific tranche of debt. Operating through my newly secured corporate proxy, I purchased the $45,000 commercial note for pennies on the dollar. The transaction was clean legal and executed entirely outside the view of my family. By purchasing the distressed debt, I did not erase the obligation. I acquired it. The legal rights of the creditor transferred directly to my holding company. I now owned the very financial instrument Diane had created to exploit me. During the initial application process for the shadow loan, Diane had been forced to list personal assets to secure the commercial underwriting. She had listed her pristine, sprawling house in Wasilla as collateral backing the note. She assumed she would simply skim my revenue to make the minimum payments, keeping the risk invisible. She never anticipated defaulting, and she certainly never anticipated the debt being acquired by the daughter she betrayed. I directed the commercial broker to execute the standard recovery protocols available to a secured creditor. We filed the necessary paperwork with the Matanuska-Susitna Borough Recording Office. I legally attached a formal commercial lien against the property deed of the Wasilla house. The execution of this maneuver required no confrontation. There was no screaming match in a pristine kitchen, no shattered ceramics on a hardwood floor, and no dramatic ultimatums delivered across a diner table. The retaliation was silent, bureaucratic, and permanent. The house in Wasilla was the crown jewel of Diane's carefully curated image. It was the vaulted, heated fortress she retreated to after the trauma of the Bering Sea. It was the physical manifestation of her belief that wealth could insulate her from tragedy. She had justified every forgery, every stolen state dividend, and every fraudulent wire transfer by claiming she was merely doing whatever it took to keep a roof over her family. She had hoarded that property, using it as proof of her superiority, while I hauled water to a dry cabin in the woods. Now that very same property was legally encumbered by my signature. Diane was sitting in a federal correctional facility, wearing a standard-issue uniform, stripped of her designer coats and her luxury vehicles. Meanwhile, a public record filed in the borough courthouse explicitly stated that the deed to her cherished suburban estate could not be sold, transferred, or refinanced without my direct written authorization. The house she claimed justified her theft now legally owed its survival to the daughter she tried to bankrupt. I held the certified copy of the recorded lien in my hands, sitting by the wood stove in my Palmer cabin. The paper was heavy and carried the official raised seal of the borough clerk. The transfer of power was total and indisputable. Diane had spent 2 decades using paperwork as a weapon to extract resources from the people around her. I had used that exact same arena to engineer a flawless, unassailable checkmate. The knot of frontier panic that had governed our family dynamic since the winter of 2003 was finally severed. I had not just survived the automated financial trap she set. I had dismantled the machine and kept the essential components for myself. With the legal and financial warfare officially concluded, the suffocating atmosphere of the Matanuska Valley began to clear. I no longer needed to hide from the fallout or maintain a defensive posture. The isolation of the dry cabin, which had served as a necessary sanctuary during the grueling months of the federal audit, now felt like an artifact of a finished chapter. I was ready to leave the proximity of Wasilla behind entirely and establish a new baseline far removed from the geography of the deception, forcing me to pack up my equipment and seek out a different stretch of the Alaskan wilderness to finally breathe. I loaded the final heavy canvas duffel bag into the bed of my truck and secured the tailgate. The dry cabin in Palmer had served as a necessary bunker during the most turbulent year of my existence. I swept the wide plank floors one final time, leaving the interior bare and echoing. I turned the brass deadbolt securing the heavy spruce door for the last owner. I was leaving the Matanuska Valley. The geography was too entangled with the memory of leased luxury vehicles tearing up the gravel and frantic demands issued in the freezing dark. I needed physical distance to mirror the bureaucratic boundaries I had established in the federal courthouse. I drove north on the Parks Highway, watching the suburban sprawl fade into dense, unforgiving wilderness. The landscape grew sharper, the spruce forests thicker and more isolated. I purchased a raw, undeveloped parcel of land just outside Talkeetna. The eccentric, resilient town sits near the confluence of 3 glacial rivers far removed from the pristine subdivisions of Wasilla. The property backs directly up to the Susitna River. I did not sign a rental agreement this time. I bought the acreage outright, utilizing the restored capital from my primary sponsor and the clean financial slate I had fought a federal war to secure. The property deed holds my signature untethered from any shadowy corporate proxy or fictitious custodial trust. I spent the brief Alaskan summer building a new structure, the physical labor of framing walls, insulating the roof, and installing a new cast iron wood stove felt fundamentally different than the desperate wood chopping of the previous winter. I was no longer swinging an axe to outrun a commercial banking freeze. I was swinging a hammer to build a permanent, unassailable baseline. The rhythmic sound of the rushing river replaced the distant hum of the highway. I was constructing a sanctuary that could not be leveraged or liquidated by anyone else. For 6 months, my online platform had remained dormant. I missed the peak winter season, the prime window for backcountry survival content. I knew I had to address the digital void. I could not simply post a highly edited video testing thermal sleeping bags and pretend the blackout never occurred. I set up my camera tripod in the center of the unfinished Talkeetna cabin. I did not adjust professional ring lights or draft a bulleted script. I hit record and stared directly into the glass lens. I spoke to the camera for 40 uninterrupted minutes. I stripped away the polished, invulnerable influencer persona. I told my audience the unvarnished truth. I described the suffocating smell of bleach and flatfish on the Whittier processing line. I explained the terrifying reality of the banking default and the grueling, secretive months cooperating with the Federal Cybercrime Division. I laid bare the mechanics of familial identity theft, detailing how the woman who raised me had weaponized my credit profile to fund a synthetic, affluent lifestyle. I admitted the profound shame and the crushing exhaustion of fighting a ghost ship built out of my own state dividends. I did not monetize the video. I uploaded the raw, unedited file and stepped away from the screen. I walked down to the riverbank, terrified that exposing my vulnerability would alienate the rugged demographic I had cultivated and sever my remaining brand partnerships. I prepared myself for the end of my public career. The reaction was a tidal wave of solidarity. I woke up the following morning to thousands of digital notifications. The comment section was not filled with pity or cynical judgment. It was overflowing with shared survival stories. Hundreds of viewers detailed their own hidden struggles with financial exploitation by relatives, validating the crushing weight of navigating toxic family dynamics disguised as mandatory loyalty. The outdoor apparel brands did not recoil from the messy reality. They reached out to reaffirm their contracts. They recognize that true resilience is not just the ability to start a friction fire in the snow. True resilience is the capacity to endure the systematic collapse of your personal foundation and rebuild it from the bedrock up. The community I feared losing ended up anchoring my return to the industry. The resolution of this ordeal does not mirror a tidy cinematic conclusion. There is no triumphant orchestral score playing in the background of my daily routine. The legal victories, the federal indictments, and the restored bank accounts do not erase the underlying grief. Diane is currently serving her 24-month sentence in a federal correctional facility. I do not visit the visitation room. I do not read the letters she routes through her court-appointed attorney. My brother Luke remains a phantom, serving his 5 years of federal probation and managing the wreckage of his own offshore gambling debts in total silence. The trauma does not vanish simply because the paperwork is filed. Some nights when the wind off the Susitna River howls against the siding of my new cabin, my chest still tightens. I think about the dark, violent water of the Bering Sea. I picture the rogue wave hitting my father's crab boat. I think about the terrified 32-year-old widow sitting at a kitchen table in the winter of 2003, practicing a dead man's signature to keep the furnace running. I hold space for the tragedy that fractured her mind. I acknowledge the brutal frontier panic that drove her to view her own children as collateral resources. Understanding her terror does not negate the necessity of the federal raid, nor does it excuse the extortion at the gala. But it leaves a lingering ache that no court order or commercial lien can cure. I mourn the family I deserved, even as I protect myself from the family I actually received. I step out onto the wooden deck of my new cabin. The morning air is crisp, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and glacial silt. Across the vast expanse of the Susitna Valley, the jagged snow-capped peaks of the Alaska Range dominate the horizon. Denali stands clear against the pale sky, an immense monument of granite and ice. When I breathe in the freezing air now, it feels fundamentally altered. It is no longer laced with the suffocating anxiety of hidden ledgers, looming commercial defaults, and stolen dividends. The generational curse of financial panic ended the moment I locked that corporate credit card on the shoulder of the park's highway. The cycle of hoarding resources and exploiting blood ties to ward off the cold stops with me. I do not view money as a weapon against death, and I refuse to build a fortress out of deception. The life I am constructing out here requires intense physical labor and constant vigilance, but the foundation is authentic. The name on my bank account, my business, and my life belongs entirely to me. That is my story. One locked credit card, a shattered coffee mug, and a hard truth forged in the cold. The sharpest sound in the world is not the crack of a splitting maul against birchwood, nor is it the heavy thud of a federal gavel. The sharpest sound is the shattering of an illusion you have carried your entire life. When the ceramic coffee mug from Dutch Harbor hit the hardwood floor of my mother's kitchen, it did not just break a physical artifact of my deceased father. It shattered a deeply ingrained American myth, the myth that providing a roof over a child's head grants a parent unconditional ownership of that child's soul. Looking back at the wreckage of my family's financial empire, the most profound lessons I extracted were not about credit scores, federal wire fraud, or cross-collateralization. The true lessons were about the spiritual architecture of the American family. We live in a culture that places an immense, almost suffocating premium on outward success. We are taught to revere the sprawling suburban home, the pristine driveway, and the ability to project stability at all costs. But my mother's desperate, tragic trajectory serves as a stark warning about what happens when the desire to provide morphs into the compulsion to possess. If we want to raise children who are resilient, morally grounded, and genuinely whole, we have to fundamentally rethink our definition of parental responsibility. The core duty of a parent is not to shield a child from every possible hardship by weaving a complex tapestry of lies. Diane looked at the terrifying, indifferent power of the Bering Sea and decided that poverty was the only enemy that mattered. In her desperate race to secure our financial perimeter, she abandoned her moral compass. She believed that as long as the heat stayed on, the methods used to pay the bill were justified. But a warm house built on a foundation of deceit is just a well-heated cage. True family responsibility requires honesty. It demands the courage to look at your children and admit when the tide is turning against you. Resilience is not forged by handing a child a life of synthetic luxury. It is forged by showing them how to chop their own wood. When we hide our struggles behind leased vehicles, borrowed status, and silent debt, we teach our children that maintaining an image is more important than maintaining integrity. We teach them to fear the truth. If we want our children to be strong, we must allow them to witness our honest survival, not our choreographed perfection. Furthermore, traditional family structures must be rooted in profound, unwavering fairness. A child is a sovereign individual entrusted to your care. They are not an extension of your ego, a safety net for your poor decisions, or a collateral asset to be leveraged when times get hard. The moment a parent looks at their offspring and says, "You owe me your survival," they have spiritually bankrupted the family ledger. Parental love must be a gift, never a loan. The food on the table, the clothes in the closet, and the shelter from the cold are the baseline requirements of bringing a life into this world. They are not line items on an invoice to be collected with interest when the child comes of age. When we blur the lines between parent and child, when we expect the younger generation to subsidize our unhealed wounds, we commit a grave emotional trespass. Fairness means raising your children to build their own tables rather than chaining them to the foot of yours. To achieve this level of fairness, a parent must cultivate intense emotional awareness. You cannot guide a child toward a healthy future if you are still running from the ghosts of your own past. Diane was still drowning in the winter of 2003. Her unhealed trauma, her frontier panic became the inheritance she forced me to carry. We all have our own version of the Bering Sea. We all have specific fears, historical traumas, and quiet terrors that keep us awake at night. The ultimate test of parenting is doing the grueling internal work required to heal your own wounds so you do not bleed on children who did not cut you. Emotional awareness means recognizing your own panic and deliberately choosing to stop the cycle. It means taking a deep breath and saying, "This fear stops with me. I will not make my child pay for the storms I had to weather." Breaking these generational curses is not an act of betrayal against your bloodline. It is the highest form of respect for the future. It requires standing in the freezing truth of your reality, stripping away the performance and deciding to build something genuine, even if it starts in a dry cabin with a single wood stove. If you are currently doing the difficult silent work of auditing your own family history, you are not alone. If you have ever had to walk away from a dinner table because the cost of the meal was your own identity, or if you are fighting to ensure your children inherit your wisdom rather than your debts, this community is for you. Welcome to Ariana Revenger. We explore the quiet battles, the hard-won boundaries, and the messy reality of taking your life back. Hit subscribe and join us, because building a life of authentic peace is a journey best shared with those who understand the price of the ticket. We all want to believe we are leaving behind a legacy of love. We want to believe that the sacrifices we make for our families will be remembered with reverence. But the truth is far more complicated. The ledgers we keep are rarely the ones we think we are writing. As you look around your own home tonight, observing the quiet routines of the people you love most, it is worth asking a difficult question. Are you building a sanctuary, or are you building a theater? When the inevitable storms come and the facade is stripped away, what will remain in the foundation? We spend our entire lives trying to ensure our children never feel the cold, but sometimes standing by the window and watching the frost gather on the glass, you have to wonder, if they ever found the hidden keys, if they ever looked at the true cost of their comfort, would they thank you for the warmth, or would they simply change the locks?